Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be here with us this morning. Welcome to this, a very special Scholar Talk. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks and I'm the Coordinator of Scholarship here at the State Library of New South Wales. And one of the real treats of my job is to coordinate the Scholar Talk series, which showcases the extraordinary research that our fellows do while they're at the library. And today is a bit special because we're joined by Dr. Rebecca Hamilton, and she's marking the first International Scholar Talk for us this morning. She's coming to us from Germany, where it is a quite ridiculous time of the morning. So it's a special thanks to her for participating in this series. Rebecca, for those of you who don't know her, is a geographer, researcher, writer, and an honorary fellow at the Australian National University. She's very committed to landscape conservation, and she was, of course, the library's Merriweather Fellow in 2019. Welcome, Rebecca.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Great. So thank you all for joining online today. And thank you for that lovely introduction, Rachel. So today I'll be talking about Sydney's misremembered swamplands, which are some of the most ecologically significant sites in Sydney. But before I delve into these swamplands, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the landscapes that I'll be talking about today, the Gadigal people and the Dharawal people. And I'd particularly like to acknowledge my colleague, Shane Ingrave from the University of New South Wales, who has provided a lot of insight in terms of traditional ecological knowledge of the landscape surrounding Kamay, and also Dan Penny, my former research advisor at the University of Sydney, who's contributed a significant amount of input into this project. The story that I'll be talking about today starts at a little site located within Centennial Park. This site is outlined in this white circle called Lachlan Swamp. And for those of you not familiar with Centennial Park, it's a large urban green space located around 4 kilometres southeast of Sydney CBD. And if you've ever visited Centennial Park, you might recognise Lachlan Swamp as the backdrop to wedding photographs, which often happen on this bridge across the Lily Pond, or you might recognise it as the site where giant populations of eastern grey flying foxes roost during the day. But unless you've braved walking under these hundreds of flying foxes, what you might not realise is the site has considerable ecological, historical and cultural significance. And at the time that we originally started working on this site in 2010, it was managed as a predominantly natural landscape setting of environmental significance with strong cultural significance that encourages visitor awareness of its sensitive natural and heritage values. And this is strongly ingrained within the parkland management policy. And these values are explicitly and implicitly conveyed to users of the parkland through fences, boardwalks and signage, which encourage visitors to keep away and protect the sensitive vegetation of the site. And one of the key historical aspects of this site, for which it's assigned very high conservation significance, is that it acted as Sydney's second water source between 1820 and the 1880s, after the tank stream within Sydney CBD became polluted and was subject to increasing droughts in the 1820s. So the location of Lachlan Swamp here is shown in the context of the geology of southern Sydney, extending from the CBD down to Botany Bay. In this map, the different colours represent different geological units. The pale beige unit on this map represents thick deposits of Quaternary quartz sands, which are a recharge source for lots of fresh water and therefore support a very large freshwater aquifer called the Botany Sands Aquifer. And this is therefore very closely tied to the historical significance of the region. Historically, this aquifer supported large chains of freshwater swamps extending from the northern boundary of Centennial Park down to Botany Bay. But one of the most prominent aspects of the Lachlan Swamp remnant in Centennial Park is its ecological significance. And in particular, the vegetation of the site is managed as a pre-British and early British landscape. Dominant taxa within the site include the swamp paperbark, Melaleuca conquinavia, which is a dominant canopy species and recognizable from the bark, which you can peel off the trunk. And this species makes up more than 80% of the canopy cover of the site. In the understory, there are sedges, including Garnia, and lots of ground ferns, including Glycemia dicarpa, which is a coral fern. Some of the secondary taxa in the site include swamp oaks, Casuarina glauca, swamp mahogany, Eucalyptus robusta, and also tree ferns. And the vegetation of the site has been recognised more broadly within New South Wales environmental legislation. So the Sydney freshwater wetlands have been listed as an endangered ecological community, and the native plants associated with this community include all of those that are presently found within the Lachlan Swamp Reserve. And the Lachlan Swamp Reserve is considered to be a last remnant of the original swamp vegetation, the pre-Indigenous vegetation of the region, with the most conspicuous species being Melaleuca conquinavia, the swamp paperbark. This listing notes that the Sydney freshwater wetlands were formerly very extensive within southern Sydney, and particularly in the area occupied by the Botany Sands aquifer, but are now very limited in extent. The map that I've included on this page shows the distribution of pre-European Indigenous flora across southern Sydney, and the coastal forest and freshwater swamp forest units, this one represented at Lachlan Swamp, shown in the bottle olive colour, and there's two remnants which you might not be able to see on this map, but there's one which is located at the within the Lachlan Swamp site in Centennial Park, and a second series of these sites are located within the Botany Water Reserve's historical site, which is listed under heritage legislation. And you may have seen these sites if you've ever driven between Sydney CBD and the airport. They extend along Southern Cross Road. Generally, when you're stuck in traffic, there's plenty of opportunity to have a peruse of them. But one of the problems with these Indigenous flora maps is a lot of the assumptions made about what constitutes the pre-European flora aren't tested against long-term environmental data. And without these long-term data, we're protecting a landscape without actually knowing what it looked like in the past. So the question then becomes, how do we determine whether or not these values are real? One of the most powerful modes of understanding past ecosystems, particularly those in heavily altered and heavily peopled ecosystems, such as the urban environment of Centennial Park, is what's called historical ecology. So this involves using a mixed methods, multidisciplinary approach to understand the social and physical dimensions of landscape change to inform pragmatic and accurate conservation policy. And some of the key sub-disciplines within historical ecology include a scientific field called paleoecology, historical inquiry, and increasingly using traditional ecological knowledge. Back in 2010, when we first started looking at the Lachlan Swamp remnant in Centennial Park, we applied paleoecology as an approach to see whether or not the current vegetation of the site actually represents the pre-Indigenous flora of the region. Just as a very brief introduction to paleoecology, it's based around the concept that pollen from flowering trees and conifers, as well as spores from ferns, are released from parent vegetation and accumulate in wetland sediments. These pollen and spores can be isolated from sediments using chemical digestions, And these sediments can then be dated using radiometric techniques such as radiocarbon dating to get an idea of how old each of these pollen layers is. And importantly, pollen and spores from different species are different shapes. So for example, in the context of the contemporary flora of the Lachlan swamp, the pollen from Melaleuca quinquenervia, the swamp paperbark, looks very different from pollen released from Casuarina glauca, the she oak, which looks very different from the spores released from ground ferns, for example, the Glycenia dicarpa spore shown in the slide here. And so this is quite useful because you can use pollen to reconstruct what was growing at a site such as the Lachlan swamp at different points in time. And we applied this technique to a short core around 40 centimetres long that we extracted from the Lachlan swamp wetland. And a summary diagram of the results of the pollen analysis is presented on this slide. I'll first highlight that the vertical axis presented on this plot represents sediment depth and therefore time. And I've just highlighted using these red dashes important time periods within the context of the Lachlan swamp. So 24 centimetres depth is equivalent to a time period of 1788 AD, which represents the European settlement of Sydney, and 1888 represents the time when the Lachlan Water Reserve was converted into Centennial Park. And what these pollen diagrams show is that during the pre-European period and the early European period, the vegetation of the site was overwhelmingly dominated by Apocridaceae, which are these lowland heath plants, as well as rushes, which are these wetland plants up here. Interestingly, the canopy taxa from this time period is very low. There were not that many trees in the landscape. The most dominant tree species that we do see in the record is Casuarina, but the abundances of these taxa are still quite low, suggesting that they're quite sporadic in the landscape, probably similar to what we see there today. But in the post-park period, you can see that the swamp paperbark, Melaleuca quinquenervia, rapidly expands in the record. And this is a significant contrast from the early European and pre-European period where the abundance of pollen from this tree type was very low, suggesting that it was quite rare in the landscape. So what this suggests is this swamp paperbark forest that we see at the park today within the Lachlan Swamp Reserve is actually quite a recent modified landscape. And interestingly, we can even see expansion of the swamp paperbark pollen in the record after 1960. So once we pull all these data together, it becomes quite apparent that what is presumed to represent the pre-British landscape at the site today is actually very different from what the site looked like in the pre-British period, which is sort of highlighted by these images, so a more open, heathy, swampy landscape. I actually went to the Mitchell Reading Room to write up the results of my thesis back in 2010. And when I was procrastinating writing up these results, I found myself going through a collection of maps that were on display in the library. And quite fortuitously, what we found was an aerial image of Centennial Park from 1951. And what was fascinating about this image is that it showed in a moment what I'd spent the better part of a year working on. And that was that the forest of the Lachlan Swamp Reserve was quite open in 1951 and also quite open in 1970 relative to the 2002 canopy cover. And this really highlights or brings into question whether or not this modern assemblage is actually reflecting Indigenous values. And interestingly, these data compare really well with what we see in the pollen record, which is this massive expansion in this overstory swamp paperbark species at 1960. So the paleoecological science that we did at the Lachlan Swamp was quite significant, and we learned several lessons from it. And first of all, and perhaps most significantly, is the fact that environmental memory about past landscapes is very short. And this really raises the questions of how did we manage to so poorly mischaracterize the landscape at the site? Is this because the past vegetation of the Lachlan Swamp remnant is an anomaly, or does the pollen record reflect the swamplands of the South Sydney region more broadly? And if it does reflect the swamplands of South Sydney more broadly, how extensive were these swamplands and other associated ecosystems? And then finally, which is relevant to future conservation of the systems, how has the hydrology of the area been altered with urbanisation? And so now we bring into the historical piece of the historical ecology pie to answer some of these questions. And I will note that many people have come before me in looking at using historical data to reconstruct past environments, including those in southern Sydney. Some notable sources that I've relied on quite heavily in this work is Benson and Howell's Taken for Granted, as well as Paul Ashton's History of Centennial Park, which describes the evolving social and environmental values associated with the Lachlan Swamp and Centennial Park. Also, the ever-growing body of information on the Dictionary of Sydney about different places and their environmental history has been incredibly useful for this research. So the work on the historical aspect of reconstructing the environmental history of Sydney's freshwater swamplands, which I undertook as part of my Merriweather Fellowship at the State Library, was based on using environmental data gleaned from maps, from images, and from documents, and incorporating these data to known spatial points within a contemporary map. And then using GIS modelling and tracing to group these features to produce overarching environmental maps for the region during the early European period, particularly looking at the 19th century environment. And these final environmental maps map the changes in vegetation, topography, and hydrology of the Botany Aquifer region, that area characterized by the Sandy Geological Unit. So the first question, which is possibly the most simple to answer using this technique, is how does the past hydrology and drainage of the Sydney freshwater swamplands compare to what's there in the present landscape? Particularly, we were interested in how extensive were these systems in the past, and how the hydrology of these systems have changed with urbanisation. The most useful map, the oldest, most useful map for reconstructing past swamp hydrology comes from the Department of Lands in 1894. And this map records in very high detail topographic data for the South Sydney region. The contours on this map are drawn at 25-foot intervals. And these topographic data are very useful for modelling past flow pathways of the swamplands and showing how the swamps drained before urbanisation of the catchment. So what I did with these maps was georeference them using GIS software and then tracing over the contour lines. So this task is incredibly time consuming and will forever remind me of my quarantine period in COVID. And then with these traced contour data, you can use or convert them into a gridded digital elevation model. And from this, you can map flow pathways across the landscape. And here's the result of the flow pathway modelling from 1894. And what this map shows is the drainage of the swamplands across the catchment from the northeast to the southwest in 5 main arms. So we then applied the same techniques of flow pathway modelling to the contemporary drainage map, which was reproduced from 5-metre topographical data produced by the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And what you can see if you compare these two maps is that the contemporary drainage of the area has been heavily fragmented by urban development. And this relates to the fact that the topography of the region is very subtle, And so a lot of the flow pathways now just follow residential streets and roads rather than the original swamp drainage lines. To characterize swamp extent, we used maps that were as old as possible to characterize the early European extent of the Sydney freshwater swamplands. And these maps typically come from the 1820s to 1850s, which is the time period where the Lachlan Swamp and later the Botany swamps in the southern portion of the catchment were being investigated as potential water resources. So they were quite mapped in quite a high level of detail. And some examples of the maps that we used from the library collection are this map from 1853, where you can see the boundaries of the swamps in the grey shading, and some more detailed focus maps. For instance, this map comes from the northern portion of the catchment. Here's the boundaries of the Lachlan Swamp and a second swamp called the Waterloo Swamp to the west. And when you reference all these swamp boundaries and overlay them, you can start to get an idea of the extent of the freshwater wetlands within the early European period. And the boundaries of these swamplands are shown by the pale blue polygons, which are overlain on the topographic data constructed from the 1894 map. And what these data show is that the swamps were incredibly extensive in the early European period, covering an area of around 11 square kilometres. And this is significantly more extensive than the contemporary extent of freshwater bodies within the same catchment. Here, this is the same vegetation map that I presented in earlier slides, where the water bodies are shown in the dark blue shading. And you'll note that they are significantly less in extent than they were in the pre-European period. However, one interesting factor to note about these sites is that the boundary of the swamps protected within the Botany Reserve, which is shown in the pink shading on this old map and is located approximately here in the new map, reflect morphologically quite a similar pattern to those in the pre-European period, indicating that these protected sites actually represent the boundaries of the pre-European swamps quite well. And the same goes for the Lachlan Swamp remnant in Centennial Park, which does indeed reflect a small fragment of the much greater Lachlan swamps of the 1820s to 1850s. We made a second map of the swamp extent between the 1880s and 1930s using the Topographic Department of Lands map, as well as some parish maps produced by Higginbotham, which derived from 1900 to 1935. And the results of this late European swamp extent compared to the early European swamp extent is presented on the slide. And what you'll note is the boundaries of the swamplands in the late 19th to early 20th century are significantly more contracted than they were in the early European period, and that the total area of the swamps is significantly less, being approximately 7 square kilometres in the late 19th century. And this is in part attributed to over-extraction of water, both from the Lachlan swamps, which is where the Lachlan Swamp remnant came from and was used as a water source in from the 1820s to 1880s, and also use of the Botany swamps, which are further south in the catchment, as a water source from the 1850s onwards. So in terms of the questions related to past and present hydrology of the swamps, we can see that the Sydney freshwater swamplands were once very extensive in the catchment, and that the size of these is significantly reduced. But given that they were extensive in the past, we would expect that vegetation ecosystems associated with these swamps to be also quite extensive across the region occupied by the Botany Aquifer. This mapping has also showed that urbanisation, particularly in the 20th century, has fragmented the flow pathways of the swamplands, which has probably fundamentally altered their hydrology. However, the boundaries of protected swampland reserves reflect the boundaries of early British swamplands, suggesting that they do, to some degree, preserve the integrity of the pre- and early British landscape. So with this in mind, the next task was to see whether or not the pollen data reconstructed at the Lachlan Swamp, particularly the pre- and early European pollen data, is continuous across the Botany Aquifer catchment, or whether or not it was an anomaly associated with the Lachlan Swamp site. The earliest descriptions of the past vegetation of the site in British history come from the famed 1770 expedition by Cooks, Banks and Solander to Camay, renamed Botany Bay, where the vegetation of the region was described as comprising some of the finest meadows in the world by Cooks, and by Banks as knee-high brushes of plants stretching over gentle and treeless hills as far as the eye can see. So these written data, when combined with the sparse annotations of these old maps describing the vegetation or the landscape of southern Sydney as sandy and barren, does give the impression that the vegetation that Cook and Banks encountered was open and not dominated by any forest taxa. And although the early colonial descriptions of the vegetation are not as kind as those presented by Cook and Banks, with Phillips describing it as the swamplands as unhealthy and Watkin Tench describing high coarse rushes growing in a rotten spongy bog. And again, mapping the landscape of South Sydney as barren and sandy supports the idea again that the landscape of southern Sydney was open. As with the topographical data and the swamp boundary data, vegetation data for the Sydney swamplands increases after the 1820s, when the sites were increasingly looked at for the potential as a water resource. And this means that we can start to incorporate vegetation data onto the hydrological maps. And the early vegetation communities of the Botany Aquifer between 1820 and 1870 have been overlaid on the map. Most of them are pretty general, but overall they suggest that the region was covered by scrub, suggesting again an open landscape. Some of the more useful data for reconstructing past vegetation actually derives from written documents. For instance, this piece of writing by Frederick Mackey from the 1850s on his walk from Waterley Swamp down to Botany Bay describes the landscape as comprising low sandhills covered with small scrub and various flowers. And interestingly, he does describe the presence of ericaceae within moister places, which corresponds very well with what we see in the pollen data from Lachlan Swamp, which are summarised in this pie chart. You can see the ericaceae at this point in time is still quite a significant portion of the landscape flora. Another useful tool for reconstructing the past landscapes and past vegetation of the sites is to use historical images in forms of paintings, sketches and photographs. These were all collected from the State Library collections and geo-referenced in space as much as possible, and the locations of which are shown very faintly by these alphanumeric numbers over the map. They do provide a pretty good coverage of the system. And the images were reproduced from the site at, for example, Lachlan Swamp, the Randwick Racecourse, and the Botany Swamps, and so on, demonstrate that the landscape flora was very open, and this openness continued to wet places, suggesting that the swamp vegetation was likely a very open community, not a closed forest community. And so what these results indicate is that the landscape of the Botany Bay aquifer more broadly and the freshwater swamps appears to have been open, scrubby and or heathy between 1770 and 1870. Importantly, there's no evidence for swamp paperbark forests in any of the documentation encountered. So this raises the question of if the vegetation was fairly continuous across the Botany aquifer and the Sydney freshwater swamplands were very extensive across the aquifer, how did we manage to so badly misremember this landscape? And this comes down to a consideration of shifting attitudes towards the swamps, as well as actions which serve to overexploit them as water resources. And this is a summary of how the valuation of the swamps changed over a relatively short period of time, in less than 100 years of settlement, and shows how the swamps were alternatively ignored and unregulated by colonial authorities, or valued and managed as a critical water resource. In 1770, we had the swamps described by Cook as the finest meadows in the world. 8 years later, the sites were considered to be unhealthy and unfit for development, which meant that they were ignored and generally unregulated. A similar attitude towards the swamps in the 1810s saw a portion of the Botany aquifer where the Lachlan Swamp is located set aside as the Sydney Common for grazing of cattle. But then by the 1820s, the value of the Lachlan Swamps as a site nearest to town and most likely to afford an abundant supply of soft fresh water meant that the sites suddenly obtained value as a freshwater resource. And then throughout the 1820s to 1850s, these sites were progressively exploited and drained, which meant that by the 1850s, the colony was again looking to another water source, and that saw the development of the Botany Swamps water scheme in the southern portion of the catchment. And throughout this time, industry and intensive water extractive industries developed within the catchment. And as with the other environmental data discussed in this talk, we were able to map the location and type of industry in the catchment, both within the early to mid 19th century and in the late 19th century to early 20th century. The location of different industry types is shown on the maps by the circles, and the colours of the circles represent different industry types, which you might be able to make out in the legend for the maps. So in the early period between 1820 and 1870, the Lachlan Swamps and Botany Swamps were fairly heavily exploited by paper and flour mills, with some development of other more polluting industries such as boiling down works and tanneries occurring typically in the Waterloo Swamp area. By 1870 to 1930, most of the flour mills and water mills along the Lachlan Swamps and Botany Swamps were removed as these sites were converted into water reserves. But industry became very concentrated in other portions of the catchment. So for example, in the Waterloo Swamp area in the northwest section of the catchment, we can see the development of some very toxic industries all over the upper portion of this catchment, including tallow and soap works, as well as boiling down works and tanneries. And this is described in the Royal Commission into Noxious and Offensive Trades, produced in 1882, as having a very significant negative impact on the ecology of the swamps. And this, of course, has flow-on impacts on all the ecosystem downstream, including Cheese Creek and the Cooks River. Similarly, in the southern portion of the catchment, we see the disappearance of Veteran Swamp between 1820 and 1870 and 1870 to 1936. And this is attributed to the development of market gardening across this area, which was apparently a little bit more fertile than other swamplands. And descriptions from newspapers written about the Veteran Swamp indicate that these sites too were heavily polluted with fertilizers, which fundamentally changed the character of the swamps and the ecology of the swamplands. So what these maps demonstrate is that industry had a big impact on changing the ecology of the sites through time, and also probably had a big impact on resulting in the reduced extent of the swamplands that we see in the hydrological maps from the site. One final point to consider regarding why the swampland flora was misremembered may relate to the fact that one of the only remaining swamp remnants that we have today is located within Centennial Park, and that Centennial Park, being constructed in the Gardner-Ness School of Landscape Design, involved significant clearing of the pristine woody shrub, draining of the site, breaking up the ground, and replacing the flora with what was considered to be more desirable European plantings. But due to the poor nutrient status of the swamplands, these European plantings typically failed, and we have evidence from Joseph Maiden, who was the second gardener of the gardens, that Melaleuca quinquennavia, the swamp paperbarks, were deliberately planted as windbreaks in 1896. So what this indicates that either due to favourable conditions for Melaleuca quinquennavia, perhaps nutrient loading associated with the parklands, or perhaps as part of a secondary tree planting initiative, Melaleuca quinquennavia became a dominant species within the swamp forest sites. So in terms of some preliminary takeaways in terms of evolving flora and evolving attitudes towards the flora of the site, rapidly shifting attitudes about the swamps, particularly by colonial authorities in the 19th century, and unregulated development of the swamplands meant that they were heavily altered by industry and also by the water sites relatively early on in their existence. And this lack of valuation of the swampland landscapes meant that there were few early efforts to protect the swamplands. Finally, it's worth pointing out that there was a complete lack of consultation in anything that I found so far with people who have a detailed knowledge of the past landscape. And here I'm particularly referring to Aboriginal people from the area. And this is very well articulated by Paul Irish in Hidden in Plain View in a description of Aboriginal people in Sydney who have maintained a strong bond with coast and natural resources, but have been ignored in colonial narratives, which seems to be the case for the history of these freshwater swamplands so far. So this brings us to the final piece of the historical ecology pie, which is something that I have not yet focused on, but I've had discussions with my colleague, Dr. Shane Ingray at the University of New South Wales. And what he describes within the landscape of Kamay is that Indigenous plants that were used, or plants that were used by Indigenous populations in Kamay, which are listed on the slide, are actually relatively consistent with what we see from long-term paleoecological and long-term historical data, which really emphasizes the value of using traditional ecological knowledge to build the story of ecological, historical ecology and inform conservation of these sites. So just some final thoughts from the work that we've conducted in the Sydney freshwater wetlands. All urban landscapes, even those that are thought to represent some versions of the past, will have long human environment legacies. And more we're seeing that this applies to almost all protected ecosystems. And this therefore requires that we adopt a long-term perspective when developing conservation policy, and that this conservation policy needs to not only be informed by natural sciences, but also the social sciences to look at how evolving attitudes towards sites resulted in their ultimate landscape expression. And with that, I will just pass on my great thanks to Dr. Rachel Franks, our fellowship coordinator, who's put up with me for the past 2 years, and also particularly to all of the staff at the State Library of New South Wales who have provided so much help with collecting all of the data that I've used in this talk. So with that, I will open up to questions.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Such a powerful talk to encourage us all to take this landscape that many of us probably just see so often as we make our way about Sydney, and just see that space now so completely differently. I don't challenge anybody to go into Centennial Parklands now and not think about those swamps. So we do have some questions coming through, and if anybody here today has any questions, just use the chat feature in Zoom and we'll ask Rebecca. So first up is a question very specifically for you. So many subfields of geography. Why swamps? What attracted you to this particular type of landscape?
I think wetland ecosystems have always been quite fascinating to me because they do preserve these really high levels of biodiversity and really high levels of ecosystem services. And there's also something fascinating about studying these systems that people do tend to overlook in their day-to-day life. But then actually from a slightly more discipline-specific person, I'm trained as a paleoecologist, and wetland sites, particularly swamps, preserve fossil pollen incredibly well. So they're very useful places to work as a paleoecologist. So part of it's discipline specific.
Question about the sediment testing that you did. Now, you said it was quite shallow, but the question is, does it damage the wetland to do that type of testing?
To take a core from it? Well, we took a core, in short, no. And in part that has to do with the fact that the vegetation of the site is actually incredibly hardy and has developed as a relatively resistant community to disturbance at the Centennial Park site. But generally what we do is using quite non-invasive techniques. So it's generally a small cylinder, maybe 6 centimeters in diameter, and you literally just physically push it in the ground and pull it up. So you're just taking a small tube of sediment out of the wetland. So we don't use any chemicals or anything like that when we extract the sediments.
And does your research confirm scrublands of the aquifer? So does this support removing the paper bark trees that have been planted there?
This is a fascinating question. I think this is something that you would have to talk about with the community to see what the community values. Do people within the area of South Sydney actually want to reconstruct these Indigenous landscapes, or do they want paperbark swamp forests where you protect these communities of eastern great flying foxes? Perhaps they have very high faunal biodiversity values. But I think it's really important to be informed about what it is that you're actually conserving in these sites. Having said that, the early landscapes of the site, these Epacris heaths, develop on very nutrient poor soils. So removing the Melaleuca quinquennavia species from this area isn't necessarily going to mean that you're massively going to get this recovery of these Epacris taxa that enjoy nutrient poor soils. It's probably quite impractical given the urban nature of the catchment.
So lots of people were asking that question. This is a little bit out of the area that you were really focusing on today, but somebody is asking if you're able to comment directly on the swamp that's near the current day Long Bay Jail.
I can't comment on that swamp. That's an interesting site. For me, there wasn't a lot of data in that area, and also it's slightly outside of the catchment area that I was looking at. But it seems like there's not a lot of data available that I found for those sites. Is there anything specific about that site?
No, that was just the question. But if you are still listening and you are still interested in Long Bay Jail and its nearby swamp, you can add some extra detail in the chat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that if we can. Did you find any evidence of where or how the lands of the traditional owners of these areas might have been marked out? It's a bit tricky.
Yeah, I mean, it's no is the short answer. Nothing that I could say conclusively, but I do think that there's evidence of Europeans essentially exploiting pathways made by Indigenous people. So you'd probably find that a lot of the roads to Botany Bay are tracked along some of the earlier paths made by Indigenous people. But you'd have to talk with some Indigenous people about that.
There's another slightly out of the area question. Has your current or past research, or perhaps some of your future research, looked at some of the lagoons near Narrabeen Lakes and Curl Curl?
No, but this work has made me quite interested in looking at some of those sites, particularly the freshwater sites, because they are included, I think, in the Sydney Freshwater Swamp communities. So they would be quite interesting to look at, to see what those past landscapes look like relative to those in the Botany Sands aquifer.
We've got lots of questions relating back to trying to restore the swamplands. People seeing through your talk how important this natural resource is. Possibly quite controversial, retracting some of the urban development that might have constrained those swamplands too much. But do you think there's an appetite for buying pieces of land that border this area and doing some sort of conservation work to restore what's been lost?
Absolutely. Especially with increased development pressure and lack of green space within the southern portion of the catchment, alongside those botany swamps, water reserves. I think there's a lot of work that can be done, not necessarily even buying back land, but perhaps undertaking restoration ecology projects to enhance the value of some of those swamps that are already protected within the water reserves. But again, I think we'd need to engage with community to actually get an understanding of what it is that people want to conserve at these sites.
Otherwise, we just make another mistake, perhaps. Somebody's asking about you and your research and what you are wanting to do next with what is obviously an extensive body of work.
Within the context of Sydney and these discussions related to the Merewether Fellowship, I would be very interested in looking at the endangered ecological communities around metropolitan Sydney more broadly, and testing whether or not some of those Indigenous plant classifications actually represent what they're purported to represent, using similar approaches, using pollen analysis and the historical data, and particularly getting traditional owners involved.
So the person asking about Long Bay has come back to us, and they used to work as an educator in the jail, and they were just curious because they had heard many locals and even some of the prisoners over the years talking about draining the swamp adjacent to the facility, but every time they tried to do a little bit of it, the swamp was much more persistent and it just kept coming back.
I wonder if that swamp is located in potentially a joint block of the Hawkesbury Sandstone or something like that. So there's probably a very concentrated flow pathway along that swamp. I'll have to look at
Somebody's asking, we have a maps researcher offering their assistance to help you find more maps at the library if you need any help.
Great.
So
send me an email.
We'll log that for you. Somebody's commenting on the importance of the work that you and the team have done, and they're wondering if you know of any other type of work that might be going on around Australia or even around the world looking at these important wetlands.
This kind of work is applied globally. Australia is an interesting case because it seems to have this greater desire potentially than other areas to protect these pre-European landscapes. But we have these incredibly long Indigenous histories as well, which need to be considered when we're looking at these long-term natural landscapes. So it's a moving space in Australian research. And I think it's a really exciting space to work in at the moment. But yeah, there are a surprising number of paleoecologists, pollen people in the world, which might surprise people.
So lots of people are asking more questions around restoration and perhaps what they can do to lobby for protecting and perhaps expanding these swamplands, and lots of people asking about working with traditional owners and listening more closely to what Aboriginal people have to say about country. Is there any advice, any tips you can give people who perhaps not scholars, just local community members who are really interested in protecting the landscapes that we have left?
I think we need to start having more collective discussions. I don't know in what format, but yeah, conservation of these systems. I think there are a lot of people, and there's a huge appetite to use Indigenous knowledge to protect these sites and historical data to inform their management. But yeah, we're going to have to start talking together and engaging in maybe more collective action. I mean, you can always email your MP.
And we can also be informed and make an effort to find out what's going on. And certainly everybody who is here today has done that by coming along to Rebecca's talk. It was a terrific crowd this morning, so thank you all very much for coming. A few people arrived late and they've asked if the talk has been recorded, and we can say yes, it has. So you'll be able to catch up on the beginning of Rebecca's talk and revisit all of what she said today and have a look at some of that great map work that she's done and look at that more closely. So that will be coming to the State Library of New South Wales website. Please don't forget that there are lots of events happening as part of your library at home. This is, of course, History Week. So tomorrow night we'll have a special History Matters talk featuring historians Emma Dortons and Mark Dunn, talking about heritage and conservation, and conveniently linking on from this talk, landscapes as well, and what we can learn about the world that is right here around us outside our front doors. Next time we'll have former C.H. Curry Fellow Dr. Ian Hoskins, and he'll be talking a little bit further out from Sydney. His research as a Curry Fellow in 2019 focused on reimagining the Pacific and looking much more closely at Australia's relationships with our near neighbours. And his talk will cover some of the complexities of those relationships over a century from 1870 to 1970. So do look online at the library's website and book in for those or any of the other talks that you see that are interesting. And please, thank you again, Rebecca. I'm not sure what time it is in Germany, but I'm guessing still quite early. So 4 a.m. We've had a request come through for you to deliver your talk again live when you come back to Australia. So I'll make sure that that is at a much more sensible time for you.
Thank you.
In the meantime, thanks, Rebecca, and thank you all very much for coming. I'll see you next time at your library at home. Bye-bye.
Thank you.